And I think we need to, okay, yeah, we need to get started. Craig, welcome. Um, Looking forward to you leading us again today. And we're getting towards the end of the book of Mark. So please go ahead, sir.
Yes, actually, the pace at which we get to the end of the Gospel of Mark will depend on how much detail we go into. But last week, I think we covered all of Mark chapter 12, and I'm going to try to keep up that pace this week, and who knows, maybe even get a little bit into 14, but we'll see. Um, so Mark chapter 13, coming judgment, be ready. Toward the end of Mark chapter 11, we have temple authorities and scribes questioning Jesus' authority. And essentially what you have two alternate forms of authority. You have a form of authority that's rooted in the scribes and in the temple. And then you have the authority of God's Son who's come. And he's not against certainly the authority of the Torah. Certainly he's not against the temple. He wants to cleanse it. But his authority is clashing with the authorities who want to keep their own power, don't want to hand the fruits of the vineyard over to the vineyard owner or the vineyard owner's son. So chapter 12, we see this conflict that's been building through the gospel, starting with conflict narratives in chapters 2 and 3, climaxing in chapter 12 in terms of verbal conflict. Chapter 13, Jesus takes his disciples aside before his crucifixion, before his passion, and tells them what to expect afterwards, that conflict is going to continue, suffering is going to continue, and yeah, he's going to be crucified, but the temple and the authority base there is also going to be shattered. So both are going to face hard times, but Jesus is going to rise from the dead. He's already been telling the disciples that, but you know, the temple, they're not quite ready to hear about the temple being destroyed either. So talking about coming judgment, impending judgment on the religious establishment. At Jesus' first coming, that would be the authorities whose authority is grounded in the temple, like the Sadducees. And retrospectively, not, from Jesus' standpoint, this would have been future. I believe from Mark's standpoint, it also would be future. But us looking back, we say, okay, well, that's not our future now. But at the first coming, the religious authorities and the religious establishment were judged. The temple was judged. That was fulfilled a generation later in the year 70 when the temple was destroyed. When I was a young Christian, I didn't know. I just figured, okay, it's talking about the second coming. I didn't even know that there wasn't a temple right now. I mean, that's how naive I was. But anyway, but the temple was destroyed in the year 70. And then Jesus also talks about his second coming. You know, from the standpoint of when Jesus is speaking, and Jesus not knowing the day nor the hour, and I think from the standpoint of Mark, because I believe he writes before the year 70, these things could be viewed together. They were both future events, future signs of judgment. But looking back, we see, okay, the one has happened already, the other, we're still waiting. But it's a warning for Jesus's followers. So religious establishment faces judgment, first coming. Second coming, are we ready? Are we watching? Or will we be like the religious establishment at the first coming? Now, does Mark know the difference between the temple's destruction and the return of the Son of Man? I think it was probably in Mark's future. And so Mark probably just saw them both as part of the end time. They had to do with God's end time promises. And part of it's been fulfilled, part of it is yet to be fulfilled. Matthew and Luke probably write after 70, at least Luke, but I think even Matthew. And so they clarify this. And thus you have some changes in the way that they word it to bring out the nuances. So Mark 13, when will these things be? What will be the sign when all these things are going to be fulfilled? So just like one question. Well, it's two questions technically. When will these things be, and what will be the sign that these things are about to happen? But they're both linked together. Matthew, when will this be? When will the temple be destroyed? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? So Matthew's more explicit in making a distinction. And Luke, he doesn't make so much of a distinction there, but later on, when Mark and Matthew were talking about the abomination of desolation, or the desolating sacrilege in the holy place, Luke speaks of Jerusalem being surrounded by armies and goes on to talk about the Jerusalemites being the ones who survived, being carried off captive among the nations. So he's talking about something that's in the past. Either that or he knows that they're going to be separate. But anyway, the end time was already occurring in the first century. And of course, we all know that. I mean, we've read Acts chapter 2, verses 17 and 18. In the last days, says God, I'll pour out my spirit on all flesh. He's saying this is being fulfilled as the spirit is being poured out in Acts 2, verse 4. They're filled with the spirit, they speak in tongues. And so he says, this is them. This is the spirit of prophecy that Joel spoke about. So we know that some things were already happening. They were inaugurated by Jesus' resurrection as the first fruits from the dead. But also the temple being destroyed, that happens within a generation. That also was an end time event, so to speak. It had to do with things that had been prophesied. But it doesn't mean that the second coming has happened yet, obviously. So that's why we talk a lot about already, not yet. The temple's destruction was an end time event, but it's not the final end time event. We're in the time in between the times. And this already fits the Old Testament prophetic model. God's promises unfold in stages. And we can think of that, for example, in terms of the end time restoration. The prophet Isaiah talks about, the exiles are going to return, the deserts are going to blossom, the Dead Sea will come alive, and so on. Well, the exiles returned. They began rebuilding the second temple and rebuilding Jerusalem. But they that wasn't, the desert didn't blossom and the Dead Sea didn't come to life. But when Jesus came back, certain other prophecies were of that restoration were fulfilled. The disabled leaping for joy, blind eyes opened, and so on, Isaiah 35. And then at Jesus' second coming, we're going to get the rest of it. So yeah, it unfolds in phases, and you don't always know until after it's unfolding, oh, okay, these things are chronologically separated, but in terms of the substance of it, they were related. So not one stone on another. The disciples are really impressed with this building. And well, they should have been in terms of, architecture or whatever. It was the most magnificent temple in all of the ancient world, because Jews had only one God, and so all their temple resources went to one temple. So the disciples say, look, teacher, what large stones and what large buildings. Galileans weren't used to that, especially, places like Capernaum and so on. But even the two Galilean cities, Sepphoris and Tiberias, people, there was nothing comparable to this massive temple, and really nowhere in the ancient world, any one building this massive. So Jesus asked him, do you see these great buildings? Not one stone is going to be left here on another. All will be thrown down. Now, some of these stone blocks were larger than those in the pyramids. Not that they were larger than pyramids, but the stone blocks that were used. You can see an example here of one of these that's now underground. You can see a Herodian stone, some Herodian stones here, just with four men linking hands just to see the size. Here you can see a massive stone block. And this is from the model. But many Jewish people viewed the temple as invincible. as invulnerable. And you can see why. I mean, it looks like a fortress. And here again, you can see it looks like a fortress. I mean, you've got walls around Jerusalem, but you've got walls around the temple within Jerusalem, just like an acropolis uh, within any ancient city was the most defensible part of the city. The Temple Mount was an acropolis within Jerusalem, and it was massive. And you can see, relative to the size of the rest of Jerusalem, how massive it was. Well, Jesus has been challenging the temple people before this. He overturned tables in the temple in chapter 11 and verse 15, and then he cried out texts from the Old Testament about the temple, Isaiah 56 and I think it's 56 verse 7 and Jeremiah chapter 7 and verse 11. He cries those out in Mark chapter 11 and verse 17. And it challenges the authorities in the temple. It challenges their honor. Once Jesus speaks and challenges them publicly and they can't answer him, well, they want to get even. They want to get their honor back. Where are the people in charge? Who's this young upstart? And so the context is challenging the religious establishment. And that becomes clear, especially in the final paragraph where Jesus starts laying in on the scribes, like he does in Matthew 23 at greater length. Matthew likes to organize things topically sometimes. The temple's destruction. Now, chapter 13 and verse 30, Jesus says, "Truly I tell you, this generation will not pass away until all these things have taken place." Well, what generation? Well, everywhere else in Mark's gospel, where he says this generation, it's referring to the generation that was then living, the generation that challenged him and so on, a generation that he says is a sinful generation. And the temple actually was destroyed in a generation, almost exactly 40 years after Jesus predicted it. Now, this fits a pattern in biblical history. When Israel sinned, God allowed the temple's destruction or desecration. Whether it was under the Babylonians, 586 BC, Antiochus Epiphanes, like 165, thereabouts BC, in the 70s BC by the Roman general Pompey, the year 70 by the Romans. Some would see what happened with a mosque being built on the site in those terms. And if it's ever rebuilt, it could happen again. Well, what merited a judgment in that generation? I mean, people were following the Torah. They were offering sacrifices in the temple. But if Jesus was God's son and they rejected him, then it makes sense that judgment would come. But also, Jewish people often spoke of the last generation as particularly evil. And sometimes, as in the Dead Sea Scrolls, this could come to be a generation of indeterminate length. So, the last generation may be a very long last generation, longer than any individual's longevity. There's some hyperbole here, some rhetorical overstatement. Obviously, some stones were left on others. It was in the retaining wall, but some stones are left on others. But even later rabbis attributed this destruction to judgment. In this context, Jesus says to flee when you see the desecration that leads to destruction. So I'm skipping ahead a little bit. I'll come back. But in 13 verse 14, Jesus talks about an abomination of desolation, which fits what he's saying about not one stone being left on another. In the year 66, Judean revolutionaries slaughtered priests in the temple and installed their own mock priest. And Josephus, a Jewish historian who actually was on the outside of Jerusalem at this point, but he's interviewing escapees from Jerusalem. Josephus calls this the fulfillment of Daniel's prophecy about the abomination that led to desolation. And 3.5 years after this, the temple was destroyed. Now, when Jesus says to flee immediately, he says, let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Well, Jerusalem was already sort of in the mountains. It was in the hill country, but surrounding hill country would be even more strategic. David was able to flee from Saul in the hill country. The Maccabees conducted guerrilla warfare from the mountains. I mean, if you can see on the slide here, the road where happily they have it fenced off for modern people. But if somebody's going up a hill like that, you can't get a whole lot of people going side by side. A massive army isn't going to help you because you're still going to be going single or double file, and people up above can be throwing down rocks and you're going to be in trouble. So the hill country was a place to flee. Most people in times of an approaching army, they would flee into the city. They'd flee inside Jerusalem city walls. The population there was so massive at this time as people fled there and were holed up there that when the Romans started their siege, you had mass starvation eventually setting in. They could make it a few months, but Jesus accurately warned, don't flee into the city, flee out of the city. And he was emphatic about haste. Let no one on the roof of their house, when they're going down, they have an outside staircase. Don't go back into the house to get anything. They had flat roofs. People would do stuff on the roof. I'll show you a few more pictures of that. So you didn't have to enter the house to get away. I don't see the steps here, but obviously there have to be steps or a ladder or something. You don't have to go back in the house, just skedaddle, get out of town fast. Here again, you can see people on roofs. Sometimes the roof of one house is the floor of another, but and here you see one of the outside staircases, probably to a courtyard, but you could leave the courtyard without going into the house. So let no one in the field go back to get their cloak. Well, it was cool when workers began at sunrise. By midday, they leave their cloak at the edge of the field. This was their blanket and their bedroll at night. We don't have to, most of us at least don't have to sleep in our sweaters or coats, although I've done that before when I needed to. But for a lot of people, this was all they had. They had their outer garment. That was their blanket at night. And so the Torah says, don't keep that from somebody overnight. Jesus says, your life is more urgent. Leave it and flee. So very emphatic about haste. Now, there may be an element of hyperbole in that, but refugees have to flee very quickly. And one of these pictures is of my wife and son just before the war. Medine had already been a refugee, but she became one again during the war for 18 months. And then the other picture is a reenactment, but by the real people, where Medine's brother Emmanuel is pushing their father in a wheelbarrow. So the refugees have to, well, a lot of refugees, they flee without even their passport that they're going to need if they have a passport. Medine took her passport, but I mean, in terms of what do you take, you don't always have time to stop and think. Jesus says, get out of there quickly because judgment is on the way. And he says, woe to those who are pregnant or nursing at that time. They're more susceptible to death. And Medine also can give the story. If you've read Impossible Love, you see her heart going out to the pregnant women as they're trying to flee, but it's really hard, and recording some who died as they were fleeing, and nursing, and especially this has to do with mourning because so many of the children die. Josephus, again, first historian who talks about the period, basically he doesn't say he's quoting from Deuteronomy, but basically it's the same thing that you have in the curses in Deuteronomy 27 and 28, especially 28. You had in the siege of Jerusalem, the hunger spread so much that you had mothers eating their children. So this was a horrible thing that was coming. Jesus says, pray that your flight will not take place in winter. winter was so difficult for travel that even armies rested, and it would be especially dangerous in the sometimes snowy Judean hills. Rivers flooded during winter, which was the rainy season in Judea, and they became hard to cross. You can see here an example of it. The Romans, in fact, captured and slaughtered a large group of refugees trapped at the overflowing Jordan, not in winter, but in the spring when it was still flooded from the winter rains in the water coming down from the mountains. Here's another picture. This is this isn't normally a river, but it becomes one at this point because of the flooding. And I guess Nashville just had their share of that. Jordan River flooded beyond its banks after winter rains. Judean hills and vineyards covered with snow in winter. Roman armies weren't usually well equipped for that. Even though they had boots and stuff, it was pretty hard on them. Here's another picture of it around Jerusalem. Haste really was important. Immediacy might be hyperbolic, but Jesus intended swiftness. I mentioned earlier when the Jordan was flooded, you had these fugitives who were coming. They were trying to flee to Jerusalem at that point. But because the Jordan was flooded and they arrived at night, they said, no, let's wait till the morning. Some of the children might drown. But in the morning light, the Roman army saw them and slaughtered them. Well, a couple years later, that was toward the beginning of the revolt. But after the spring of 68, so a couple years after the beginning of the war, refugees couldn't even surrender to the Romans. Before that, the revolutionaries blocked the doors, the gates. You couldn't get out of Jerusalem easily, but some people managed to escape other ways, over the walls, whatever. They'd flee, they'd surrender to the Romans. But after the spring of 68, word got around among the Syrian recruits in the front lines that Jewish fugitives had swallowed jewels and things like that, so that, their next bowel movement, they can take them out and they'll have something to live on. So from that point on, whenever anybody escaped, the front lines, the auxiliary troops would hold them down, take a knife or a sword, and slice them open. Sorry, my pacifist sword. Slice them open to see if they had any jewels inside. But because Jesus had given the warning, and also there were Christian prophets in Jerusalem, and they said, we need to get out of here. This is the time that Jesus spoke about. And they fled to a mountainous region, actually beyond Judea. They had time to get away, and they fled to the Decapolis area. In the year 70, after the temple was destroyed, Romans erected their standards, the standards of the Roman legion, at the site of the temple. These bore the insignia of the Roman emperor, and the Romans sacrificed to the image of Caesar on the site of the temple. Now, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, these are called idols. And Josephus says that earlier, under Pontius Pilate, Jerusalemites had preferred death to allowing these idols into their holy city. But now these idols on the Roman standards are being sacrificed to the image of Caesar is being sacrificed to in the very site of the temple. And of course, Romans dedicated coins. The emperor dedicated coins celebrating his subjugation of Judea. Jesus says this will be tribulation like never before. And this echoes Daniel chapter 12. There'll be a time of distress or tribulation, such as not happened from the beginning of the nations until that time. In intolerable tribulation, God has compassion on his own. And these are just some, just to think about, there have been times of intolerable tribulation since then. But these are not but these tribulations don't all mean that Jesus is coming right the next minute. When he really comes, the final, second coming of Jesus, even the sky will declare it. The sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will be falling from heaven, and the powers in the heavens will be shaken. That's not literal astronomy, obviously, but cosmic repercussions. Then they'll see the Son of Man coming in the clouds with great power and glory. He sent out the angels, gathers his chosen ones from the four winds of four ends of the earth to the ends of heaven. Now, sometimes we have interesting rapture theology that people come up with. Have you decided when the rapture will be? I think it's still up in the air. We have rapture helmets we can offer you at a discounted price in case you're inside and you go through the ceiling when you go up. And also insurance, so you can. No, we're just joking. But people do weird things with this. They go crazy. Some of the stuff on the internet, and I guess this will be on the internet too, but some of the crazy stuff on the internet, when I teach a course in Revelation at the master's level, the first week I tell all my students, okay, next week, over this week, your assignment for next week, bring all the craziest stuff you can find. We need to get out of everybody's system. So, people coming to class saying, okay, well, this website tells you that the Antichrist is this person, Barney the dinosaur or whatever. And one website for a certain fee will take care of your pet during the tribulation after you're raptured, all that stuff. That's not the way Jesus was teaching this. When Jesus comes, there's not going to be like time to prepare. When he comes, that's it. Besides the events fulfilled in 70, Jesus also and the second coming, Jesus also gives some non-signs for the end. So the temple has to be destroyed before he comes back. That's already happened. But then he's going to mention some other things earlier in the chapter. False prophets. Do we have those today? We could probably name a few of them. Wars, rumors of wars. God knows we've got too many of those today. Famines, earthquakes, certainly those go on today as well. But those were also going on in the first century. And these were things that Jewish people were using as signs of the end. When this generation comes, the Messiah is about to come. Jesus says, when you see these things, that doesn't mean that the end is already is ready to come. You'll keep seeing these things. So some of the things you'll hear prophecy teachers today saying, these are signs of the end. Actually, Jesus was saying, no, those aren't the signs of the end. You'll see those well before the end. He says, these are just the beginning of birth pangs. But you can expect them through history. This is a whipping post in Corinth. Paul probably stood before it. But Jesus says such things must happen. The end is still to come. It's just the beginning of birth pangs. By contrast, he lists one prerequisite for the end. He says, and the good news must first be proclaimed to all the nations. You want Jesus to come back? Well, 2 Peter talks about looking for and hastening the day of God. Says that he hasn't come back yet because he's waiting for more people to come to repentance. Well, he's waiting for the good news to be preached among all the nations. Now in this picture, the ones going up with the briefcases are my students who take their homework with them everywhere. No, not really. Paul applies Jesus' end time teachings in 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. 2nd Thessalonians, some people debate whether Paul actually wrote it, but I think it's pretty clear he wrote it. Nobody after 70 is going to write about a man of lawlessness seating himself in the temple, although certainly Romans did offer sacrifice to Caesar on the side of the temple, but it didn't work out quite literally the way you have it in 2 Thessalonians 2, or maybe it'll happen again. Some of these things keep happening through history, but Jesus, beware of false prophets. 2 Thessalonians 2 talks about it, the ultimate false prophet. Jesus talks about end time apostasy and lawlessness. So does Paul. Jesus talks about the beginning of birth pangs. So does Paul talks about the final birth pangs. Desecration of the temple by the Romans, man of lawlessness worshipped in the temple, claiming to be God. Elsewhere, Jesus says, you don't know the times of the seasons of Israel's restoration. Paul says, we don't know the times of the seasons of Christ's return. Jesus talks about his coming. This is actually wording in Matthew rather than Mark at this point. Parousia, often used for a royal coming of kings or dignitaries. Paul speaks of Jesus coming using that same Greek word, and also our meeting together with him, which was a term that was often used when a dignitary would be coming. People would go out to meet that dignitary and form that dignitary's escort on the way into the city. So meeting Jesus on his way down. He comes in the clouds, is in both. You don't have to have everything in both, but you've got so much of it in both that it's pretty clear to me that it's talking about the same thing. Gathers his elect by his angels, gathers believers by the voice of the archangel, gathers them by the sound of a trumpet. That's Matthew, that's not Mark, but again, you have it in both Jesus' teaching and Paul, where Paul also speaks of it as the last trumpet when the dead are raised. He comes like a thief in the night. You have that in both. Paul clearly meant to refer to Jesus' teachings. There were a number of different end time scenarios among their Jewish contemporaries, but Paul echoes precisely the motifs that Jesus taught. Paul gives these by the Lord's own word. And these teachings, Paul says he passed on to them, language that was often used for passing on what one received from an earlier teacher. The earliest letters in the New Testament, well, in my opinion, earliest, at least second earliest, for those who think Galatians is earlier, but the earliest letters in the New Testament, I think, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, thus attest that Jesus gave these end time teachings, and probably this attests it before the Gospels are written, within 20 years after Jesus spoke these things. These are being written down by Paul. But they also show us something else. Jesus talked about his second coming immediately after the tribulation. Paul uses these sayings of Jesus to talk about Christians' rapture, to meet Jesus in the air. So when Paul talks about Jesus descending from heaven with a shout, and when shouts conjoined with trumpets were normally war cries, Paul seems utterly unaware that anybody could place the rapture at a different time from the second coming. And Paul places this after the coming of the Antichrist. So elsewhere, Paul says concerning Jesus coming and our gathering to him, that won't precede the day of the Lord, which Paul said earlier is what comes like a thief in the night. It comes like a thief in the night, but before that, day of the Lord and our gathering to him and Jesus coming. Before that, he says, the man of lawlessness will be revealed and the apostasy will happen. He also says in 2 Thessalonians, we won't receive rest from our sufferings until Jesus comes to destroy the wicked and publicly glorify the saints. And that's why Jesus overtakes them like a thief to destroy them. They're not ready. All the passages that talk about not knowing the day nor the hour, if you look at the context, they're all talking about Jesus coming at the very end. So we have a tradition in some circles that Jesus will rapture out his followers 7 years before the end, or 3.5 years before the end. And so Jesus' followers won't have to go through the Great Tribulation. In many parts of the world, Jesus' followers have been going through Great Tribulation for 2,000 years. There's no reason to expect the pattern to change at the last. Jesus said they can't do anything worse to you than kill your body. They've been doing that for a long time. The popular view, and you can see why it's popular, is that Jesus raptures his church before the final period of tribulation. But what he talks about the abomination of desolation and so on, that happened in the 1st century already. So nobody actually attests this view that the church will be raptured before the tribulation until the year 1830, at least not in its fullest form. Nobody taught that until 1830. So there were different views on the millennium and other things, but nobody taught this view. So Luther, Calvin, Wesley, Augustine, none of them saw this in scripture until 1830. The early church fathers believed we were either going to go through the tribulation or we were in it already. Yeah. So is it possible that Jesus meant to warn us about something and that maybe Christians should expect to go through suffering? I have a friend in Mozambique where Christians, and not just Christians, but among them, Christians have been beheaded for their faith, tortured for their faith, not by the Mozambican government, but in other settings. And he laments the teaching in the West that Christians won't go through this kind of stuff. He said, we're going through it now. I was attending seminary in the same building as the missions headquarters a number of decades ago. And the China had just opened up, and so missionaries were going back. And the missionaries came to some of the churches that had been founded by their predecessors a generation earlier. And the Chinese Christians in that setting said, go away, we don't need your help, because you left us here to do this. When all the Christians from the West left, you told us that there would be a rapture before the tribulation. We thought you had been raptured, and we have been left to go through the great tribulation. We've been through it. Jesus said we have to be willing to take up our cross and follow him. He also said no one knows the day nor the hour, not the angels, not even the Son. So that's obviously not something the later church made up. When Jesus became flesh, he limited himself in some ways. If Jesus didn't know the day nor the hour, it's surprising how many people on the internet think they know the day and the hour. Also surprising that people think they can identify who's the final Antichrist. The devil has to have Antichrist in waiting. He doesn't know who the final Antichrist is, because certainly the devil doesn't know the day nor the hour. But anyway, the conclusion of this chapter, before the passion narrative starts, Jesus is warning us of our passion before he goes to his. The conclusion of this chapter is watch, be ready. Verse 33, keep alert. Verse 37, keep alert. In between, he has a parable, the doorkeeper, about how we need to keep alert. And here are just pictures of people back then. Well, these aren't people back then, but like people back then, how shepherds would watch their flocks at night, and how guards would stand guard. And this actually becomes a trial run before the final future events, verses 33 to 37. He's saying, watch and be ready. Well, they're going to get a foretaste of this in Jesus' passion. And so we get a foreshadowing of that. Do the disciples watch? The next chapter, Jesus says, watch and pray lest you succumb to temptation, lest you fail the test. But each time, while Jesus stayed awake and prayed, his disciples failed the test. They didn't watch. They weren't ready. And when the time of testing came, they all abandoned him and fled. That was the trial run. When our time of testing comes, will we be ready? How do we get ready? We watch and pray. We keep walking with the Lord, and whatever tests we have, we don't go looking for them, but well, you can fast or something, but don't go looking for other kinds of tests. They'll come, but pass the tests you face, you'll be more ready to pass the bigger tests that come, just like in the book of Daniel. Now, next week, we'll talk about the women followers who frame the passion narrative, the woman who anoints Jesus' feet at the beginning of Mark 14, and the women who come to anoint him for his burial too late after he's risen from the dead. And we'll start talking about the passion narrative, which fits this time of year. But for now, that is Mark 13, and handing it back to Dwight and Apurva, and I'm grateful to you guys for your help.
All right, great.
My partners, my fellow ministers in this.
Yeah. Thanks, Craig. Let's. There's one or two questions that are in the chat right now. You can just quickly go right into them. There's one here. If there's an option to pray that day of tribulation wouldn't be in winter, is it able to be altered by our prayers?
Sounds like it is. Sometimes I think, when Gaius Caligula was emperor, he died, I think around the year 41. So around 37 to 41, somewhere in that period. Gaius Caligula was emperor. He wanted to set up his image in the temple in Jerusalem. So it looks like, it was almost ready to come, and maybe the Christians prayed it away then. I also think, though, that God knows the end from the beginning. I think this is the best way I've been able to reconcile some of the different things in Scripture. There's a sense in which God knows he has things planned out, but God builds into that plan opportunity for our choice and our prayers. He responds to those on a level within his plan, even though he knows the outcome. He knows what we're going to pray, and so on. So if you've heard of debates between Calvinists and Arminians, this is one of the places where it becomes acute. But I had a friend years ago. He was a student at a Calvinist seminary. I was an Arminian, and we were just good friends, so this came up sooner or later, and we were debating about it in a friendly way. And I said, well, I believe God's sovereign, but I also believe that people have free will. He says, oh yeah, I believe people have free will. And I said, I believe God sovereignly enabled us to have free will. That's why we have it. He agreed. And we went through it piece by piece. And at the end of it, I said, you're an Arminian. He said, no, you're a Calvinist. And what I learned from that is, if you really try to be faithful to the Bible, sometimes you don't worry about the categories so much as just be faithful to how it fits together biblically. But yeah, God is sovereign, but he builds into that sovereignty, builds into his larger plan room for our engagement and interaction with him because of his great love for us.
Great.
And I think he foreknows what we'll do, but I mean, he works with us on that level.
Thanks. There's a question that because I didn't want to forget this question. But you mentioned Mark, Luke, and Matthew, and the way that they approach this whole subject, where it seems Mark being written a bit earlier, some perspectives change in Matthew and Luke. Can you maybe talk a little bit about that? I mean, did he not? How can I put it? You talk about the prophecy. There's the 70 AD, and then there's also the future. So it's like this at a particular verse. There's this switch sort of thing. Can you talk a little bit more about that? How that happens? If you're reading and then suddenly you switched into another 1,000 years ahead in one verse or something like that. Yeah. It's things like that.
Yeah. Well, we do speak of progressive revelation. Also, prophecy in the Bible normally, I mean, you have an exception, I think, in, say, Daniel 11, but normally in the Bible, you don't have prophecy in terms of it's going to be this long. You don't have a precise chronology of events. You may know one happens after the other, but you don't know how long after. So in the Old Testament prophets, the coming of the Messiah, they didn't know there were two comings, so it all gets squished together. And Jesus says he didn't know the day nor the hour, so I'm sure Mark didn't know it either. After the temple is destroyed, people can look back and say, oh, okay, so there is a space here. But they were used to that. I mean, that's how other prophecies had been, even in terms of, the day of the Lord is at hand. They'd been saying that for 700 years, prophets have been saying. So, but there were things God was doing imminently that were foreshadowing the ultimate day of the Lord. And then, the ultimate day of the Lord is still to come. And yeah, God has continued to act in history. But in terms of writers clarifying it by adding certain things, you have that a lot of times in scripture. Some people complain about it, and usually the people who complain about it are people who are so conservative that they're inflexible, like, well, they couldn't change the wording, or people who are so liberal that they're like, see, they changed the wording, it's not true. Instead of people who say, okay, this is how God revealed himself to us, and each writer, under the inspiration of the Spirit, is contextualizing for their own audience. So Matthew and Luke are able to contextualize it for their audience. We can assume Mark was doing the same. They don't change the substance of it. The substance of it, I mean, the prophecy is still the same. It's just, they can add in, okay, we're more aware of a gap, so we make it more explicit. You see that even, say, in Luke 5:19, in Mark, where the paralytic is let down through the roof, it says they dug through the roof. Matthew just leaves out the roof part of the story, but in Mark, they dig through the roof. And that's the way houses were built in Galilee. You could dig through the roof. But Luke is writing for a northern Mediterranean audience where they had roof tiles. And so Luke doesn't say they dug through, he says they tore off the tiles. So he's contextualizing it the same way we do when we preach it. And some people, depending on how loosely you translate, do it when they translate. The New Testament actually does this when it quotes the Old Testament sometimes. It'll reword it to bring out the point more clearly for their audience in a particular setting. Acts chapter 2, verses 17 and 18, where Peter applies Joel's prophecy. Joel said, afterward, I'll pour out my spirit on all flesh. Peter says, in the last days, I'll pour out my spirit on all flesh. Well, how can he do that? Well, he knows the context in Joel. He knows it's going on to talk about at the time when God restores Jerusalem. And as far as Peter's concerned, well, and actually, as far as we're concerned, I mean, it was an end time event. It is the last days, but it's not the end of the last days. We're still, you have that same point, switching back to the point about the progressive, not just progressive revelation, but the prophecies are often filled in phases. 1 John 2:18, you've heard that an antichrist is coming. Even now, there are many antichrists. Or 2 Thessalonians 2, where Paul says, the man of lawlessness is coming, but even now the mystery of lawlessness is already at work. And there were other people. You can see some of this in the Dead Sea Scrolls too, where you have the foreshadowing of future events and current events. You have it in the book of Joel, where it talks about a locust plague as an invading army in Joel chapters 1 and 2. And then in Joel 3, in the English version, in Joel 3, you have an actual army. But both are being portrayed in terms of the day of the Lord. And so the nearer locust plague, this nearer judgment on Judah or Israel, I think it's Judah. Anyway, this near judgment of this locust plague is a foreshadowing. It's it's an experience sort of the day of the Lord, but it's a foreshadowing of the ultimate day of the Lord, when the nations would gather together and God would bring in his final judgment.
Great. Thanks. I'm not seeing any more questions on the chats. If there are any more questions, please, if you can send them up there. But another thing, Craig, while we wait for this, you touched on the rapture, right? And the rapture is something that, growing up, especially even as a young Christian, something that we expected. I even remember one of the first songs I heard Andre Crouch. It won't be long. We'll be leaving here, and count the days as whatever. Yeah, and any day now we'll be gone. We'll be gone. We'll be, So those are the sort of things that we grew up with, and even now you still have that kind of thinking. I mean, it's quite strong. You sound like you are post-tribulation rapture.
Yes.
Then the rapture you don't go to heaven, you come straight down.
Right.
I mean, maybe just explain. I
Yeah.
think you touched on it. Just
yeah, I might have a well, it's trying to put it up on the screen would be too complicated. I actually have a book on it. I showed that in one of the slides just in passing, but a book Michael Brown and I did. But I went to a pre-tribulational Bible college. I mean, great people there, but we didn't agree on that point. All the scriptures. People used to ask me, well, what do you recommend on post-trib? I hadn't written my own book, but even if I had, I mean, my first recommendation would be, read the New Testament, or, get a book for pre-trib, look up all the verses in context, and you'll be post-trib if you look up the verses in context, because none of them say that. The rapture and the second coming at the same time. I mean, we're looking for one event. Now, things happen in phases. So it's not to say, he couldn't do it in phases, but there's no biblical statement that he will do it in those phases. So you can't really argue from scripture before an event that it's going to happen in stages. So what we have many people were looking for, all Christians rightly look forward to the Jesus' second coming. So I agree with Andre Crouch. Larry Norman's song back then, I wish we'd all been ready. I mean, that fits too, even though the movie that went with it took more liberties. But looking for the second coming. And Jewish people were looking for the coming of the Messiah, the raising of the dead, the fulfillment of the kingdom, all those things. Well, Jesus is going to bring those, but it's already not yet. He's already started those. But around 1830, John Nelson Darby came up with a system called dispensationalism. Now, the 1830 version is different from progressive dispensationalism today. So I'm not throwing dispensationalists as a whole under the bus, but John Nelson Darby said God can't deal with Israel and the church at the same time. So there's going to be a final period of 7 years where he's going to deal only with Israel. He's not going to deal with the church. And for that to happen, he's got to take the church out beforehand. And so, he wasn't looking to get out of tribulation. He was looking to separate Israel from the church. Since 1948, I think that's a little bit more difficult to say God doesn't work with them both at the same time. But in any case, so he ended up with a two-stage pattern: rapture, 7 years later, the second coming. But there's no scripture that actually distinguishes them. And the texts that talk about us being caught up in the air to meet him are also texts in context talk about him coming to reign. So yes, in post-trib, my belief is that if a person hadn't been taught otherwise, there's no way that they would read the Bible and distinguish the rapture from the second coming. They would see them as both the same event.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. That's useful. I think
No,
that's
no, no. I do want to add, because sometimes people get really heated on these things. We were. I mean, this is not an issue that we divide over. This is a secondary issue. So, wonderful brothers and sisters hold a range of views on this, but I ended up having so many debates about this in that pre-tribulational Bible college context that I never lost a debate. So I'll just say that. Oh, on that subject, never lost a debate.
all right. Okay. That's great. I mean, and it is true. People get very heated on this, and I found that in some contexts, it's actually better not to talk about it, because some are so dogmatic that you can get thrown out, and if you even just begin to sound different, they will see you as a false teacher, and they will.
Yeah, they would have thrown out Luther, Calvin, Augustine, Wesley. They would have thrown out all these people before their own time. But the takeaway, not to make a pun on rapture, but the takeaway for this is we need to live in expectation of Jesus coming. We do need to be looking for his coming.
Yes.
That should not be played down, whatever your view on the tribulation. But also Jesus warns us it's going to get worse before it gets better. In this world, we'll have tribulation. Be of good courage. Jesus has overcome the world. We share his cross. We share his passion. But we also share the hope, because just as Jesus rose from the dead, we too will be raised from the dead when he returns.
Amen. Our time is up. We'll end it here. Thank you very much, Craig.
Thank you, Dwight. God bless you.
Okay. Thanks, Apuva.